The first clue was a persistent, low hum coming from the basement, a sound I'd only ever heard on a quiet summer night after a thunderstorm, when the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and charged with electricity. It was an unnatural sound that vibrated through the floorboards of my room, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that felt more like a pulse than a machine. I'd mentioned it to my dad, but he'd simply shrugged, saying it was probably the old furnace acting up again. Nothing to worry about. My mother, usually the first to fuss over any minor household issue, had been unusually dismissive, her hands fluttering nervously as she changed the subject to a TV show we were watching. Their coordinated indifference was the first thing that struck me as odd. It was a silent, unacknowledged agreement to ignore a problem that was clearly there. The hum continued, a constant nagging presence that whispered secrets only I seemed to be able to hear. I am a 22-year-old named Chloe Mitchell, and our family home, a beautiful 2-story colonial on a quiet, tree-lined street, was my entire world. It was more than just a house. It was a sanctuary filled with a lifetime of memories. My parents, Robert and Diane, had always told me that every penny they ever earned went into this house, into creating a perfect haven for our family. They'd sacrificed so much for it. Luxurious vacations, fancy cars, even new clothes, and I always admired them for it. Their frugality was a point of pride, a testament to their love for me and the life we built together within these walls. My father, a stoic man who worked long hours as a civil engineer, had personally overseen every renovation and repair, meticulously documenting every detail in a thick, leather-bound journal he kept locked in his study. This house, he would often say, was his life's work. The second clue appeared a few weeks later, when I was home alone one afternoon. My parents were out running errands, and the house was eerily silent except for that low hum from the basement. Bored, I decided to tackle a chore I'd been putting off, organizing the jumble of old boxes in the garage. As I sorted through forgotten Christmas decorations and dusty photo albums, a small metal lockbox caught my eye, tucked away on a high shelf behind a pile of old newspapers. It was an old lockbox, the kind you'd see in a vintage movie, with a tiny, intricate clasp. I shook it, and the faint rattle of paper inside told me it wasn't empty. My curiosity, once a gentle whisper, was now a loud, insistent shout. This was clearly something my parents had wanted to keep hidden, and every instinct in me told me I needed to know why. I worked the lockbox open with a bobby pin, my heart pounding in my chest with a mixture of guilt and excitement. Inside, I found not just one, but 3 thick manila envelopes, each one labeled with a date in my father's precise, meticulous handwriting. December 15th, 2004, July 2nd, 2007, and February 10th, 2011. I pulled out the first envelope, and the papers inside felt crisp and official. They were legal documents, contracts, and deeds, all related to our house. My eyes scanned the first page, and a single sentence leapt out at me. The property at 145 Sycamore Lane is hereby transferred from the ownership of Frank and Eleanor Thompson to the Mitchell family, contingent upon the complete and final repayment of all outstanding debts and liens. My blood ran cold. The Mitchell family? I'd always thought the house was just ours from the start. I read on, my fingers trembling as I held the documents. The pages outlined a series of increasingly complex financial arrangements. There were loans, private agreements, and legal notices that I couldn't fully comprehend, but one thing was abundantly clear. Our family home was never really ours. It was a loan, a debt that my parents had been paying off for nearly 2 decades. The documents mentioned a balloon payment due in a few months, a massive, final sum that would either secure our ownership or force us to forfeit the house. The dates on the envelopes coincided with major events in our family: my 5th birthday, my high school graduation, and the month my father retired from his first job. Each of those milestone moments had been marked by a new, desperate attempt to hold on to a house that was built on a foundation of deceit. My mind raced back to all the things I'd never questioned. The worn-out car my dad drove for years. The way my mom always packed a lunch for him instead of letting him buy something from the cafeteria. The endless discussions about the rising cost of utilities that they'd have over dinner. I'd always seen these as signs of their dedication and careful planning. But now they felt like frantic efforts to keep up with a secret financial burden I knew nothing about. I had always believed my parents were a team, a united front in building a secure life for us. But these documents revealed a different reality, one where they were constantly on the verge of losing everything, and I, their only child, had been kept completely in the dark, blissfully unaware of the precarity of our existence. The second envelope, dated 2007, contained a new set of loan documents with a different company. A company named Legacy Investments, and a handwritten note from my dad scribbled in the margins. The Thompsons are threatening to take the house. Need more time. This is the only way. My stomach twisted into a knot. The idyllic life I had always cherished suddenly felt like a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest breath of wind. My parents had told me so many times that they had everything under control, that our family was secure, that I never had to worry about a thing. Now I realized their reassurances were lies, carefully constructed to shield me from the truth, to protect me from the very real and present danger that our home, our sanctuary, was on the line. The final envelope, dated 2011, held the most shocking revelation of all. It was a short, terse letter from a law firm demanding immediate payment. The letter stated in no uncertain terms that if the balance was not paid in full within 90 days, the Mitchells would be evicted and all their personal property forfeited. I froze, the paper crackling in my hands. The date on the letter was just 2 months ago. My parents had known for 2 months that we were on the brink of losing our home, and they hadn't said a word. The hum from the basement now sounded less like a machine and more like a ticking time bomb, counting down the seconds until my entire life, the life I thought I knew, came crashing down around me. I quickly placed the documents back in the envelopes, tucked the lockbox back onto the high shelf, and wiped away any fingerprints I might have left. When my parents returned, I acted as if nothing had happened, my movements slow and deliberate. My dad gave me a weary smile and asked if I'd had a good afternoon. "It was good, Dad," I said, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. My mom bustled past me, carrying groceries, and her smile was just a little too wide. Her eyes just a little too bright. I knew now that their smiles were masks, their cheerful demeanor a performance they put on every single day to convince me, and perhaps themselves, that everything was okay. I had been living in a carefully constructed fairy tale, and I was about to find out that the monster wasn't under my bed. It was sitting at my dinner table. The secret was out, but the mystery was just beginning. I needed to understand why they'd kept this from me. Was it to protect me, as they claimed to protect me from all the other things in life? Or was it something more sinister? Was there another option they weren't telling me about? I had to find answers, and I knew the first place to look was in my father's study. The leather-bound journal was the key. He had a meticulous habit of documenting everything. And I knew that if there was a deeper, darker truth about the house, it would be in those pages. I planned to wait until they were asleep, then sneak downstairs and find that book. The hum from the basement was still there, a constant reminder that I was now an unwilling participant in a game I didn't know how to play. That night, the low hum from the basement was all I could hear as I lay in bed, the sound amplified by the new and terrifying truth I had uncovered. I waited until I heard my parents' bedroom door click shut and the faint murmur of their late-night conversation fade into silence. My own door creaked ominously as I slipped out, a familiar sound that had never before filled me with such anxiety. The hallway was a corridor of shadows, and every floorboard seemed to cry out as I moved, a symphony of creaks and groans that sounded like a warning. I crept past my parents' closed door, holding my breath, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I made it to the landing and paused, peering down the dark staircase, a pit of dread forming in my stomach. The house, once a source of comfort, now felt like a living entity, its secrets lurking in every dark corner. The door to my father's study was ajar, a sliver of moonlight illuminating a path across the dark hardwood floor. I pushed it open just enough to slide through, my eyes immediately drawn to the imposing mahogany desk that dominated the room. It was a fortress of a desk, covered in stacks of neatly organized papers and blueprints, a testament to my father's meticulous nature. I knew the leather-bound journal was in the top left drawer, the one he kept locked. He had always been so careful, so secretive about it, and now I understood why. It wasn't a log of his life's work. It was a chronicle of his desperation, a detailed record of the years he spent living a lie. The thought filled me with a cold, hollow rage that was quickly replacing my initial fear. I found his spare key, a simple brass key hidden under a loose floorboard near the bookshelf. A trick he had taught me when I was a child. A game of secrets we used to play. The irony wasn't lost on me. I slid the key into the lock, the metallic click echoing loudly in the quiet room. Inside the drawer, nestled beneath a stack of old folders, was the journal. The leather was worn and soft under my fingertips, the pages yellowed with age. I opened it to the most recent entry, and my eyes immediately fell on a phrase that made my breath catch in my throat. Final notice. My father had known for months that this was coming. He knew that the home we lived in was about to be taken away. I flipped back through the pages, my heart sinking with each new entry. Each month, the journal chronicled a new loan, a new payment plan, a new lie he'd told my mother and me to cover the growing financial abyss. I discovered entries from over a decade ago, detailing a predatory loan they had taken out to buy the house, a loan with an interest rate so high it was almost criminal. They had been trapped from the very beginning, and every decision they had made since had been an attempt to escape a financial nightmare they had created for themselves. He wrote about his shame and his fear of losing everything, and I realized with a jolt that his carefully constructed persona of a successful provider was just a facade, a desperate attempt to maintain his authority and control. My hands shook as I turned the page, and the next entry was even more shocking. It detailed a secret agreement my father had made with a local investor, a man named Mr. Peterson, the very same man who lived across the street from us. My father had sold him the rights to the land the house was built on, a small patch of property near the back of our yard, in exchange for a large sum of money. The agreement stipulated that once the loan was paid in full, Mr. Peterson would be granted ownership of the land. My father had done it to buy himself more time, to make the balloon payment, to hold on to a house that was never truly his. It was a desperate, foolish plan, a gamble with our entire future, and it was clear from the journal that he was losing. The last entry, dated just a few days before Thanksgiving, was a cryptic message. "It's time. I have no other choice." The phrase echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition of what was to come. I knew what he meant. He was out of options, out of time, and out of money. The hum from the basement suddenly made sense. It wasn't the furnace. It was something else, something I needed to find. I crept down the basement stairs, the low hum growing louder with each step. The air was colder down here, and a strange metallic smell hung in the air. I saw a large wooden crate in the corner, covered in a dusty tarp. It was humming. My curiosity outweighed my fear as I pulled the tarp away. Beneath the tarp was a heavy industrial-sized generator, the kind you would see at a construction site. I looked around, and my eyes landed on a series of thick black cables snaking out of the generator and disappearing into the wall. I followed the cables, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and found them connected to a complex series of wires that fed into our home's main power panel. But the power panel was dark, and I realized with a jolt that the generator was not powering our home. It was powering something else, something connected to the house's foundation. My heart hammered in my chest as I knelt down to examine the cables more closely. As I did, I noticed a small engraved plate on the side of the generator, and the words on it made my stomach drop. Legacy Investments. The same company that was listed in the documents I found in the lockbox. I realized with a sickening certainty that the company wasn't just a lender. They were the owners of the generator, the ones who were controlling our power, our lives, and our future. They weren't just a financial institution. They were a group of investors who had been preying on desperate families like mine for years, offering them a chance to buy a home and then trapping them in an endless cycle of debt and manipulation. My parents weren't just victims of a bad loan. They were pawns in a long-standing game of emotional and financial extortion. I was so consumed by my discovery that I didn't hear my father's footsteps on the stairs until he was standing right behind me. "I see you found it," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. I turned to face him, the flashlight beam catching his face, and for the first time, I saw a look of complete and utter defeat in his eyes. He had been so proud of his ability to provide for us, but now, faced with his failure, he was a broken man. "Why, Dad? Why did you hide all of this from me?" I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, and a deep sigh escaped his lips. The silence was louder than any words, and in that silence, I knew the whole story. He finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't want you to worry. I didn't want you to have to carry the same burden that I did." The excuse was a worn-out record I had heard 1,000 times, and I wasn't buying it. "This isn't about protecting me, Dad. This is about you. You wanted to be the hero, the man who saved his family from a disaster you created, and you were willing to sacrifice everything, even our family's trust, to do it." My words hung in the air. A final, definitive period at the end of a long, dark chapter. My father didn't deny it. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the generator, the machine that symbolized his failure and our family's inevitable demise. I knew at that moment that our home was more than just a house. It was a monument to my father's pride and my mother's complicity. The confession was a quiet surrender, a final acknowledgement of the web of lies my father had woven. I stood there in the chilling silence of the basement, the air thick with the metallic tang of the generator, staring at the man who had been my hero my entire life, the man who had once built me a treehouse with his own hands, who had taught me how to ride a bike and to throw a baseball, was now a stranger to me. I felt the last vestiges of my innocence shatter, a feeling of profound betrayal washing over me like a cold wave. The house, which had been the symbol of our family's love and security, was now nothing more than a cage, and we were all prisoners, held captive by a debt that had been a secret for far too long. I knew in that moment that I could not trust my parents to get us out of this. The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to sit at the breakfast table with them. I could barely look at them. I retreated to my room, the sanctuary that no longer felt safe, and began to formulate a plan. I needed to understand every single detail of their financial nightmare, and I knew the journal in my father's study was my only hope. I spent the entire day locked in my room, poring over the pages, meticulously documenting every loan, every payment, and every lie. I made a timeline of their deception, a heartbreaking narrative of a family's slow descent into financial ruin. The more I read, the more I understood that this wasn't just about a bad loan. It was about a deeply ingrained pattern of secrecy and a refusal to face the truth. They had been living in a fantasy world, a bubble they had built for themselves, and they had let me live in it too, blind to the dangers that were lurking just beneath the surface. I discovered that the secret arrangement with Mr. Peterson was more than just a quick fix. It was a desperate gamble. The journal entries detailed how he had a pre-existing lien on the property, a lien that my father had no idea about. Mr. Peterson, in a move of pure cunning, had used my father's desperation against him, offering him a new loan that would pay off the previous debt and giving him a small portion of the land as collateral. It was a classic bait and switch. And my father had fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. I realized with a jolt that Mr. Peterson had been playing a long game, slowly acquiring the properties around the neighborhood and then using his position as a creditor to take them over. He wasn't just our neighbor. He was a predator in a business suit, a shark in our placid suburban sea. I began to research Mr. Peterson, digging into public records and local news articles. I discovered he was a well-known figure in our community, a philanthropist who had made a fortune in real estate. But a deeper dive revealed a different story. He had a history of acquiring properties in financially distressed neighborhoods and then flipping them for a profit, often using predatory loans and questionable legal tactics to force out longtime residents. I found articles detailing lawsuits against him, all of which had been quietly settled out of court. He was a master of his craft, a man who built his empire on the misery of others. My father wasn't his only victim, and I was sure I wouldn't be his last. He had targeted my family, and he had been waiting patiently for the moment to strike. My anger began to boil over. It wasn't just about my parents' deceit anymore. It was about a cold, calculating man who was preying on a family in crisis. I decided I couldn't just sit back and watch our home be taken from us. I had to do something. The more I read about Mr. Peterson, the more I realized that the only way to beat him was to outsmart him. He was a man who operated within the gray areas of the law, using legal loopholes to his advantage. I needed to find a way to expose him, to reveal his true nature to the community he had so carefully fooled. It was a risky plan, one that could backfire and leave my family in a far worse position than we already were in, but I was willing to take the risk. I knew my father's journal held the key. It was a treasure trove of information, a detailed record of Mr. Peterson's deception. It was all there, the dates, the amounts, the cryptic conversations they had had over the years. I even found a copy of the original agreement they had signed, a legally binding document that, if I could prove it was signed under duress, could be used to challenge the lien on our property. I knew this would be a difficult fight. But I also knew that I couldn't back down. This was more than just a house. It was about justice. It was about making a stand against a man who had been profiting from the suffering of others for far too long. My mother, sensing the change in me, tried to talk to me one evening. She sat on the edge of my bed, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. "Chloe, your father and I are so sorry," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "We just wanted to protect you." The words were hollow, an empty apology that felt like a flimsy excuse for a much deeper betrayal. "I don't need protecting, Mom," I said, my voice flat. "I need the truth." She flinched, and I could see the tears welling up in her eyes. "We didn't want you to see us as failures," she said, her voice a whisper. "We just wanted to give you the perfect life." I shook my head. The perfect life was never about the house, Mom. It was about us. It was about being a family, and you gave that up the moment you started lying." The conversation ended there, and I knew that a chasm had formed between us, a crack in our family that would never be fully repaired. They had chosen to protect their pride over my trust, and that was a decision I couldn't forgive. I was now on my own, a one-woman army fighting a battle that my parents had been too scared to face for years. I knew I couldn't do this alone, so I started reaching out to my friends, people I knew had a background in law and finance. I was a fast learner, and I knew that with their help, I could build a case against Mr. Peterson, a case that would not only save our home, but also expose his predatory practices to the entire community. I spent the next few weeks working tirelessly, fueled by a mixture of anger and a steely determination. I met with a pro bono lawyer, a woman who had a history of fighting against corporate greed. She looked over the documents and told me it was a difficult case, but not impossible. "He's good, Chloe," she said, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "But he's not invincible. He's left a paper trail, and we can use it against him." The words filled me with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a new kind of hope, one that wasn't dependent on my parents' lies, but on my own strength and resolve. I was no longer a victim. I was a warrior. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Our mailman, a kind elderly man named Bill. He had been delivering mail to our street for over 30 years, and he knew everyone and everything. I saw him one morning, and in a moment of desperation, asked if he had ever seen anything suspicious at Mr. Peterson's house. Bill paused, his eyes thoughtful. Then he told me that for the last few years, a delivery truck from Legacy Investments, the same company that was on the generator, had been making a weekly stop at Peterson's house. The driver would always park in the back and make a delivery, a large crate that looked just like the generator. It was the confirmation I needed, the paper trail, the legal documents, and now a witness. The pieces were finally coming together. Armed with the knowledge from my father's journal and Bill the mailman's confirmation, I felt a surge of adrenaline. The fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks was replaced by a cold, unwavering determination. I knew what I had to do. The plan was simple, yet risky. I would confront Mr. Peterson, but not alone. My lawyer, Miss Evans, advised me to gather as much evidence as possible before we made our move. We needed to be ready, to have every piece of the puzzle in place before we went up against a man who had built his career on exploiting legal loopholes. Our first step was to get a closer look at that generator, to find a serial number or any other identifying mark that would tie it directly back to Legacy Investments. One night, under the cover of darkness, I snuck back down to the basement. I used my phone's flashlight, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew my parents were asleep, but I still felt like I was walking a tightrope, the slightest sound a potential disaster. I found the generator in the corner, and on its side, tucked away in the shadows, was a small engraved plate. I snapped a picture of it with my phone. The plate read, "Legacy Investments. Model G3000, property of Legacy Investments, LLC. It was the smoking gun, the concrete evidence that tied him directly to the predatory loan and the hum that had been tormenting our family for years. I sent the picture to Miss Evans immediately, a triumphant smile on my face. The pieces were falling into place. The next morning, I woke up to a series of frantic text messages from Miss Evans. She had done some digging on her end and had found that Mr. Peterson, using a different name, had acquired a series of properties in our neighborhood, all of them under financial duress. He had used the same predatory loan structure, the same type of generators, and the same legal tactics to force out longtime residents and acquire their homes. Our family was not an isolated incident. We were part of a pattern, a string of victims that he had been preying on for years. The news filled me with a cold, righteous fury. I was no longer fighting for just my family. I was fighting for our entire community, for every family he had wronged. I scheduled a meeting with Miss Evans, a clandestine coffee at a small cafe downtown. I arrived early, the picture of the generator on my phone, the journal in my bag. She looked over the evidence, her face a mask of grim determination. "Chloe," she said, her voice low and serious, "this is a big deal. We're talking about a class action lawsuit. This could take down Legacy Investments and expose Mr. Peterson for the predator he is." Her words filled me with a sense of purpose. This was it. This was my chance to not only save our home, but to get justice for every single family he had wronged. We decided that our first move would be to approach him, to let him know that we were aware of his game. We would give him one chance to settle, to back off, before we took our case to the media. We walked to Mr. Peterson's house, the two of us a united front, a small army against a corporate monster. His house was a mansion, a sprawling architectural masterpiece that stood in stark contrast to the small, cozy homes he had been trying to take over. He answered the door himself, a fake smile plastered on his face. "Chloe, Miss Evans, what a surprise," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Miss Evans didn't mince words. She held up the picture of the generator. "We know what you're doing, Mr. Peterson. We have a mountain of evidence that proves you're running a predatory loan scheme, and we are prepared to take our case to the media and the courts. You have one chance to do the right thing and settle this. Let our family and the other families you've wronged go." Mr. Peterson's face went pale. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated rage. "You think you can threaten me?" he said, his voice rising in volume. "You're just a little girl, and your parents are a couple of desperate fools who fell for a business deal they couldn't handle." The words were like a punch to the gut, but I didn't flinch. "They were desperate, yes," I said, my voice steady and strong, "but they weren't fools. You're the one who underestimated us. You messed with the wrong family, Mr. Peterson. We're not going anywhere." He slammed the door in our faces, but I didn't care. I knew we had him. He was rattled, and his rage was a clear sign of his fear. We had won the first round. I went home that day with a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a battlefield, and I was the soldier fighting for its freedom. I went to my parents' room and told them everything, every detail of my plan, every piece of evidence I had gathered. My father was shocked, his face a mixture of pride and disbelief. My mother was more reserved, but I could see the tears of relief in her eyes. "You did all of this?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "You saved us." I shook my head. "No," I said, a small smile on my face. "We saved us. Together." It was a lie, of course. I had done it alone. But for the first time in my life, I felt like we were a real family again, a family that was finally ready to face the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Our confrontation with Mr. Peterson was just the beginning. The small taste of victory had ignited a fire in me, a burning desire for justice that went beyond just saving our home. I realized that my revenge wouldn't be complete until he was exposed for the criminal he was, until the community he had so expertly fooled saw him for who he really was. My lawyer, Miss Evans, agreed. We began to work on building a case, a class action lawsuit that would not only save our home, but also hold him accountable for the suffering he had inflicted on so many other families. I spent countless hours going through my father's journal, cross-referencing every name, every date, and every address with public records. My parents, once so guarded and secretive, were now my biggest allies. They provided me with all the information I needed, giving me access to every file, every legal document, and every cryptic note my father had written over the years. We were a team now, a family united by a common enemy. The fear and anger that had once driven us apart were now a source of strength. We worked together, each of us a soldier in this war for our home and our future. Once a proud and stoic man, was now humbled, but his determination was stronger than ever. My mother, once so timid, was now a fierce advocate for our cause, calling friends and neighbors and telling them the truth about Mr. Peterson. The first breakthrough came when I found a name and a number in my father's journal, a man named Mr. Thompson, the original owner of our house. My father had written a note next to his name. The first victim. I called the number, my heart pounding in my chest. A kind, elderly voice answered, and I explained my story, telling him everything I had learned about Mr. Peterson and Legacy Investments. Mr. Thompson was silent for a moment, and then he let out a deep sigh. "I'm not surprised," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "He did the same thing to us. He promised to help us with our mortgage, and then he trapped us in a cycle of debt. We lost everything." I told him about the class action lawsuit we were building, and he immediately agreed to join us. He told me about another family, the Millers, who had also been victims of Peterson's scam. I reached out to them, and they too were more than willing to join our cause. The dominoes were starting to fall. I found more and more families, all of them with the same story, all of them trapped in a cycle of debt and despair by Mr. Peterson and his company. I realized that my family was not alone in this fight. We were just the first ones to stand up and say, "No more." The feeling was exhilarating, a sense of power and purpose that I had never felt before. Our case against Legacy Investments and Mr. Peterson was now a force to be reckoned with. We had over a dozen families, all of them with compelling stories and ironclad evidence. The media, catching wind of our story, began to take notice. A local news station wanted to do an expose, and I immediately agreed. I knew that the more public we made this, the harder it would be for Mr. Peterson to hide his lies. My parents were hesitant at first, afraid of the public shame. But I reminded them that this was our chance to get justice, not just for us, but for everyone. They agreed, and we prepared for the interview. The day of the interview, I sat in front of the camera, my parents by my side, and told our story. I told them about the hum in the basement, the secret documents, the truth about Legacy Investments, and the years of deception we had all been living under. I held up a copy of my father's journal, and I told them about the other families who had been wronged. My parents spoke too, their voices filled with a mixture of regret and resolve. They admitted their mistakes, and they told the world about the difficult choices they had to make to try and protect me. It was the most honest and raw conversation we had ever had, and it was a public declaration of our truth. The story went viral. The community was outraged, and Mr. Peterson's carefully constructed reputation began to crumble. Other victims came forward, and soon the media was swarming his house, demanding answers. The man who had once been a pillar of the community was now a pariah, a villain in his own story. The lawsuits began to pile up, and soon Legacy Investments was under investigation by state and federal authorities. The victory was sweet, a feeling of satisfaction that was more profound than any revenge I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about getting even, it was about getting justice. Mr. Peterson, cornered and with nowhere to run, finally offered to settle. He would release the lien on our house, and he would pay a hefty sum to all the families he had wronged. But the settlement came with a condition. We had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I looked at my parents, and I knew what they were thinking. They wanted to take the money, to finally be free of this nightmare, but I knew that was not an option. We had fought too hard, exposed too much, to let him get away with it. We were not just fighting for our house, we were fighting for the truth. I told Miss Evans to reject his offer. The war wasn't over yet. We would not back down. He had one more card to play, one last desperate attempt to save himself. He called me personally, his voice a low, threatening growl. "You've made a terrible mistake, Chloe," he said, his words filled with a chilling menace. "You should have taken the money. You don't know who you're dealing with." I laughed, a bitter, sarcastic laugh. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Mr. Peterson," I said, my voice steady and strong. "I'm dealing with a coward who preys on desperate families and hides behind a corporate facade. And you're about to find out what happens when you mess with a girl who has nothing left to lose." I hung up the phone, a small, victorious smile on my face. The final battle was about to begin. The final confrontation arrived in the form of a summons to court. Mr. Peterson, realizing we wouldn't back down, had filed a desperate injunction to halt our public campaign, claiming defamation. It was his last, misguided attempt to intimidate us, to silence the truth he had tried so hard to bury. But we were ready. I stood in that courtroom, not as a desperate victim, but as a witness to a crime, a prosecutor of a man who had made a living from the misery of others. My parents, now my unwavering allies, sat in the front row, their faces a mixture of pride and resolve. The hum from our basement was a distant memory, replaced by the hushed whispers of the courtroom and the sharp click of the judge's gavel. Ms. Evans, a legal eagle with a fire in her belly, methodically dismantled his case. She presented the evidence, the journal, the pictures of the generator, the testimony of the other families who had been wronged. She painted a picture of a man who was not a philanthropist, but a predator. A man who used a facade of generosity to mask his true intentions. Mr. Peterson sat at the defense table, his face a grim mask of fury and disbelief as his carefully constructed world came crashing down around him. He had underestimated me, and now he was paying the price. He had expected me to be a helpless girl, but I was a woman who had found her voice, a woman who had nothing left to lose. The judge's verdict was swift and decisive. The injunction was denied, and a date was set for a full civil trial. But we didn't have to wait that long. The very next day, a news report broke the story that Legacy Investments had been raided by federal agents, and Mr. Peterson had been arrested. The lawsuits, the public outrage, and the overwhelming evidence we had compiled had finally brought him down. The feeling was surreal, a heady mix of triumph and relief. The war was over, and we had won. Our house, our home, was finally and truly ours. The victory was sweeter than any revenge I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just about winning, it was about reclaiming our lives. The aftermath was a slow, painful process of rebuilding. The trust between my parents and me had been irrevocably broken, but we were working on it. We talked, truly talked for the first time in years. They admitted their mistakes, and I, in turn, tried to understand the fear and desperation that had driven them to lie. The hum from the basement was gone forever, replaced by the sounds of a family learning to live honestly with one another. Our house, once a monument to lies, was now a sanctuary of truth, a place where we could finally be ourselves, flaws and all. The experience had changed us all. We were a different family now, scarred but stronger. I took the money from the settlement, the restitution from Legacy Investments, and I used it to help the other families who had lost their homes. I started a non-profit organization, the Legacy Foundation, a group dedicated to helping families who were victims of predatory loans and unscrupulous real estate schemes. My parents, in a show of support and a way to atone for their mistakes, became my first volunteers. We were now a team, not just a family, but a force for good in our community, helping others avoid the same mistakes we had made. The hum from the basement had been a warning, a secret that had almost destroyed us. but we had turned it into a beacon of hope for others. My life was a new kind of story, one that was not built on lies but on strength, resilience, and a fierce commitment to justice. I still had moments when I was angry and hurt, but I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, a warrior, and a hero in my own right. My parents and I had a long road ahead of us, a long journey of healing and forgiveness. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that no matter what, I would never again be held captive by a secret. The house, our home, had been a symbol of our deception, but now it was a symbol of our freedom, our redemption, and our unwavering commitment to the truth. The story of my life had a new beginning, and this time, I was the one writing it. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought on the home front. If you've ever felt like your world was built on a foundation of lies, let this be a reminder that you have the power to uncover the truth and build a life of your own. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.